Globalization is but a euphemism for neo-imperialism, since the ownership of capital, finance capital, commodities and productive forces are equal, supposedly equal and equitable, yet it purports to be inclusive and overarching across borders, boundaries of nation states. Neoliberalism, and which is what we are focusing on, although akin to what would be the control of capital and the market, assumes agency and independent decision-making not only by nation-states but by individuals. In theory, this may have some basis in reality, since it is conceivable that a single country or group of countries are neoliberal states with independent agency. Indeed, historically, its conceptual formulation was not in terms of a sort of internationalism or neo-imperialism, but of how a country organizes its own economic structure within the country. Theoretically, it is based on the presumption that the individual stands alone and has freedom to choose its relationship to the market. In its heightened or more purest form, it places the individual at the center, with each individual making their own decisions of how they will govern and conduct their lives, including how far they will go in terms of individual agency based on either individual agency or the trickle-down effect. Neoliberalism is an ideology that has no name. George Monroe asked the question, do you know what neoliberalism is? And goes on to say, its very anonymity is both the symptom and the cause of its power. Yet, so pervasive has neoliberalism become that we seldom even recognize it as an ideology. This anonymity stems from its supposed premise of individual agency. And again, as George writes, today the dominant narrative is market fundamentalism, which assumes that the market can resolve all political, social, and economic problems. Thus, business needs to be freed from social control. The market is the mantra, the god that rewards the winners and punishes the sinners or the losers. The goal of the market is capital, and the goal of capital is the growth of capital, in which individuals are only social capital to feed the underlying coffers of capitalism. This economic conceptualization has within it an added dimension that new colonialism, new imperialism, and globalization of capital refuses to admit. It is capitalism which is with an ideological construct in which individuals perceive themselves as free and perceive themselves as being able to make individual decisions. You know, you buy this lipstick as opposed to another lipstick or whatever. Neoliberalism has been much debated in recent years, and perhaps the most significant thesis recently, 2015, is Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution, in which she takes the position that neoliberalism is a governing rationality through which everything is economized and in a specific way. Human beings become market actors and nothing but. Every field of activity is seen as the market, and every entity, whether public or private, whether person, business or state, is governed as a firm. In this formulation, the market is not something out there, but internalized in every aspect of life, including individual relationships. And where giving in charity or philanthropy are not an outpouring of sympathy or empathy, but is determined itself by market forces. The ideology of capitalism and the relation of capitalism to the individual rests to a large extent on the dynamism of capitalism itself, since it appropriates collective demands and gives in enough to diffuse dissent and confrontation. The 8-hour working day is a classic example, but almost all movements over the last several decades have been co-opted and subsumed when they appear to rock the boat, or worse, when they actually try and transform the hegemonic structure. Capital does this slowly by giving in enough to keep things on an even keel, while giving the impression that the collective demands by the movements have scored twice. These palliatives led to the acceptance by radical movements of funds to support their opposition to the very forces, giving the narratives. For movements, this invariably meant funding specific programs, projects, initiatives. Mari and I argue that the autonomous, dynamic, critical, and often confrontational women's movement for substantive structural change fell victim to this piecemeal, private-public partnership, collaboration, and cooperation. The women's movement during the 1970s and the 1980s was a turning point in terms of its scale and scope, very different from earlier phases of the women's movement. In the United States and Europe, in socialist countries, in Latin America, in Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and indeed in Pakistan, women within countries and across borders were challenging, confronting, and demanding not reform, but a radical restructuring and transformation of all structures that oppress women, including the state, capitalism, ideology, militarization, and the war machine, the suppression of women's aspiration and agency, and all institutions that were premised on the oppression of women, including the institution of marriage and the family. The demands, intensities, and strategies varied, yet women came together in a universal demand for international recognition of women's oppression and exploitation as a key problematic for world attention. Movements in the 1960s, anti-colonial, anti-imperial, national liberation struggles, democratic, anti-military, peace movements, civil rights, gay movements, student movement, and the women's movement, these were important because these earlier feminists actually came out of these political struggles. And they came out of these political struggles to a large extent because of the patriarchy within those movements. They were a response also to those. The debates during this period was a coming together with an overarching theoretical understanding and the multiplicity of womanhood. Yesterday there was a rich discussion between Farzana and Nibi is on my mind. But anyway, on the multiplicity, well, on the one hand, an overarching womanhood and the multiplicity of womanhood. This rich discussion, I think we ought to continue discussing. I think not today, but continue discussing. But our own position is that fortunately, feminism has no goddesses. And fortunately, feminism doesn't have a Marx. And fortunately, there isn't even a feminist canon. I mean, a canon of what we before. But clearly, feminism is a theory in the making, in a constant process of making, connected as the feminist theory is to the feminist movement and the questions thrown up by the movement. And this theory that is meant to go back to the movement. Nor in feminism is there a worked out conclusive utopia, because each new idea, new reality will produce a new opposition. Since we are discussing the concept of gender with the writer, that we're discussing this concept as the binary as it was understood when it became part of the development of gender, gender and development. And we do not address, and we're mindful of that, the multiplicity and fluidity of genders as they are being understood now. And we do apologize for that, but we weren't really looking at gender and development here. Our apologies are also to those of you who are very familiar with feminist theory and this process. So if those of us who are very bored, you can just switch off. If you're not that bored, it's a reminder of things you have read and forgotten. But the theoretical stance, at this point we have, lost one page in this. What we had three strands going. One was that there was a little more on the global women's movement all over the world, not necessarily even knowing about each other, but they were the turning phase globally by the women's movement. At the same time, this gave rise to what we call women's studies, because they came out of the very concept of the question why. If this is happening, why is it happening? And women were actually feminists writers or researchers were responding to that. We have then, and I'm doing this, we're doing it very, very perfunctorily, simplistically, but the liberal feminist, in large part, is her story. It is the story of, women's movement story is the story of liberal feminism, where women have taken, and in most cases continue to take, the position that the state is a neutral arbiter of competing interests. And in furthering the women's rights agenda is one of demanding reform from within, for equal rights or restructuring of power relationships between women and men. In this construct, there has been a tendency to see these demands as if they have universal validity, which to a large extent is the rationale for demanding international agreements, conventions, declarations from political and economic forums such as the United Nations, etc. Marxist feminists position themselves within theoretical Marxism within the frame basically articulated by Friedrich Engels, and they argue that exploitation is a question of mode of production, the economic formations, and also by ideology. In other words, women are exploited both by capital and by men, since women are exploited in the household as unpaid labor, which suits both men and capital. Radical feminists, a forerunner of the radical feminist theoretical position, is the contribution of Kate Millett in her book Sexual Politics. Millett argues that patriarchy cannot be understood simply as the rule of the father or patriarch, and that it should be seen as systemic since it articulates itself as political domination in every sphere of life, and through all institutions including the family. It is from this understanding that the critical feminist formulation of the person as a political emerged, since every aspect of one's life has political implications. The focus of radical feminists on rape, sexuality, violence against women, and biology continue to be fundamental issues of the women's movement. Socialist feminists, and we're spending a little more time on this because that's where the agenda comes in. Socialist feminists argue that while Marxists see economic base in capitalism as the root of women's subordination and the radical feminists see biology as a basis of patriarchy, these are not mutually exclusive. So socialist feminists therefore added a very rich and dynamic understanding of the problematic of women's oppression and exploitation. A significant contribution to the work was by Juliet Mitchell in The Women's Estate, in which she explores four structures that oppress women. One is production, that's women are used as a army of labor, women who are the last to be hired, the first to be hired, in terms of production, production of capital. The second is reproduction, because women bear children, there is a need to control women, and for this, the ideology of motherhood is perpetuated, which traces down the basic role of women as mothers, even in social societies. The third is sexuality. Women's sexuality needs to be controlled because of parentage, lineage, before DNA, etc. And fourth was the process of socialization within the family, that women and men are socialized differently within the family, which reinforces the subordination of women. In other words, there's a dialectical relationship between socialization and ideology. Gender was conceptualized within the socialist feminist theoretical tradition and is part of a complex and holistic formulation. The concept of gender is not a standalone and cannot be accessed without addressing the mode of production, the social relations of production, capitalism, reproduction, sexuality, the family, marriage, and the process of socialization and ideology. Equally important to note is that all feminist theoretical work was connected to the feminist movement with the questions addressed by theory stemming from the movement and theory going back into the movement. The very premise of feminist theory and women's studies as a discipline is the dialectical relationship between action and theory, and just as feminist theory has actually no grounding unless it is connected to the movement, the women's movement cannot separate itself from a theoretical understanding and intellectual debate. The third process that was going on, the three processes of the women's movement we talked about in the 60s and 70s, the type of theoretical research being done. A third global process that was happening at that same time was the recognition by governments, particularly from the global south, that national and global development had not trickled down, and that women had been left out of the political process. This was detrimental not only to women but for national development itself, since by excluding the productive potential of half the population, development itself would be forestalled. Influenced by the dynamism of the 1960s, 70s of movements, which witnessed people power, and the transformational demands of equal rights and democratic dispensations, governments were also mindful that women's oppression and other oppressions based on class, and race could no longer be ignored. This process led to the UN 1975 UN declaring it the year of the women, and it organized the first World Conference in 1975. While this was an affirmation of the demands made by women linked, including Pakistan, linked the issue of development to, while this was an affirmation of demand made by the women's movement, and while some governments, and I'd like to point this out, Pakistan being one of them, linked the issue of development to disarmament and peace as the focus of the conversation remained developmental and development-centric and non-political. So Pakistan, actually, statement on this is much more radical than the others. It's basically, there can be no development without peace, no peace witut demilitarization. It was Nusrat Bhutto who said it, so we understand the context. Politics, however, rose to the fore in the second one, conference in 80, especially a confrontation between the North and the South. And here we see a global disconnect on the issue of Palestine, to the extent that it almost fell apart, the global women's movement. The third conference in Nairobi, held in 1985, was a turning point not only for the UN and national governments, but for the women's movement. In many respects, the two processes took on narratives of their own, with the women's movement becoming stronger as a result of the global coming together, and the UN restricting itself within the parameters of development and bringing women into the mainstream. While the final report of the Nairobi Conference doesn't mention these terms, nevertheless it foregrounds policy and legislative reform, projects, programs, action plans, funding, and a process of reform from within. The women's movement was to be supported by governments and the UN within subscribed parameters, since the UN and governments were wary of the challenges posed by the more political and autonomous women's movement. The decade between the third and fourth conference, held in Beijing in 1995, witnessed a total shift in the parameters of the debate and the politics of the autonomous women's movement. The threat of a global oppositional and confrontational movement for fundamental structural transformation, not least that of capitalism and systemic patriarchy, had to be diffused by systematically including women into the existing structures and accepting the more palatable demands. The women's movement was rapidly co-opted, regulated, relegated, fragmented, sectoral funding, etc., all of which we are familiar with. At the same time, feminist academia was mainstreamed into the confines of the university, with the result that feminist activism and feminist theory morphed into distinctly separate spheres with little connection between the two, with research within the university becoming increasingly esoteric and incomprehensible, while research within the movement was increasingly limited to policy and position papers and reports and evaluation and consultancies and monitoring, whatever. The term gender was used in the Beijing platform for the first time in the world, but it was formulated in the following terms. In addressing the inequality between men and women in the sharing of power and decision-making at all levels, governments and actors promote an active and visible policy of mainstreaming a gender perspective in all policies and programs, so that before decisions are taken, an analysis is made of the effects on women and men. So we are getting this total shift from the core of what was gender, which came out of social, into something totally trivialized, and saying in effect that men need to be included, and nice guys don't confound them, etc. This third formulation was a complete reversal of the politics of the theoretical understanding of the previous 3 decades, and the government and UN, and here I'm quoting, should seek to reverse the trend, and then did so by pushing the movement back into liberal feminism with a reformist agenda. Feminists globally and in Pakistan have repeatedly written about this. In 1997, Veena Sehgal, myself, wrote a very long critique of this thing, basically arguing, analyzing what had been happening, and said that a large number of feminists, etc., are now using the term gender, where one day basically need women. We were talking about women, women's equality, and women's equality has become gender equality, etc. And feminist thought, they said, has gone back from being alternative and oppositional to mainstream and establishment thought. And world development agencies have appropriated the language of feminism and co-opted it to its own discourse and its own politics. The notion of gender in this construct means both women and men, or either men and women, and implies that both women and men are equally oppressed by the strict sexual division of labor, and the emancipation of both is necessary for society to be free. While men are also locked in strict masculine and feminine divisions, they are the ones who gain by patriarchy in this division, and the women too will lose. I'm cutting a bit of this thing, but basically the notion of gender, as it is perceived in development, denies patriarchy even if the word is used. And it denies it for many reasons that have been discussed before, but it depoliticizes the issue of women's subservience. In fact, men and women stand are entities that stand in a confrontational position, because men are not equally oppressed, and within the structure of social relations, they are positioned differently to women. Notions of gender training, sensitization, activities, etc., etc. Okay, you are not So anyway, what we're basically saying is that we don't know why. But we know why the UN did it, we know why donors did it, we don't know why feminists did it. So why feminists became complicit in this. And the irony was that women who had most to lose were the ones who became complicit, who became part of this comfort zone, while women who were actually challenging it are the ones who will even risk their lives to marry the man that they want to marry. So it's a complete disconnect that the leadership of the movement is somewhere else, and actually the ones challenging patriarchy are somewhere else, and those we don't notice at all. No, I'm going to get to this thing. Now, I'm skipping some part of it, etc., but I do want to get to the one that we have on NGOs in Pakistan. All this continued, not in Pakistan, it's actually everywhere. But over the last, in the earlier phases, I do want to make the point that the global feminist movement was supported by, it was run by women from the South, etc. But the women who had come out of the 60s and 70s, struggles all over the world, who had actually joined the donor communities. So we, as our counterparts, we had the Green Party, the Marxists, the Maoists, whatever, who also had joined from that end. So there was a complete sort of free-for-all in the very early stages, on the first 20 years actually, it was that early. And they thought that they were supporting from that end the same global women's movement. But over the last decade, the solicited projects, where the third mode of operation is this open call with an agenda that's already been defined, with the mandate already been down, the quantity, where, which area, etc., and where the donors themselves have decided the agenda and the time span, etc., and you have to bid. So you are now that firm that is bidding. This process is very akin to colonialism, where the raw material was produced in the colonies, taken to, because these issues are ours, identified by women in these countries. But the raw material, those ideas, those processes, are produced in the colonies, taken to the metropolitan centers for processing, and the finished product then brought back to the colonies for marketable consumption. So the raw material in this case are ideas, experiences, knowledge, initiatives, etc. The international community is, I'll skip this again because I think we all know what's happening in terms of consortium funding and the larger funding, subcontracting, the consultancy narrative. But and the scale, where we're talking about quantitative as opposed to qualitative and long-term work. Now, because of this, the professional requirements and all these mandates that you have to fill within given time spans actually corporatizes those NGOs. So those who are not willing to or not getting into that corporatization are the ones being left out. Invariably, those are the women's groups. Because they're small money, they're not running the national, program, and it goes against their values. So they are the ones who actually lost out in this. We have a quote in this which we do want to sort of bring in. Einstein wrote at another time, but something that's perhaps even more valid today, and it's our general critique on what's happening in the donor funding community. A perfection of means, he writes, and a confusion of goals seems to categorize our age. Of course, he was talking about 100 years ago, but it's even more relevant to us now. Most NGOs are not financially corrupt, not the ones that we're talking about. But the problem is, where does the accountability lie? Is it to the people that they work for, or is it to their donors? And who has decided that they will make the narrative and they will decide, and who are they accountable to? Certainly the people in the name and of the funds, where the funds come in, are not, they're not responsible to them. Bilateral agencies, etc., are also involved in this type of funding, and to the extent that these large NGOs even support national mechanisms like the National Commission on the Status of Women.